Welcome to multi-subnet clustering. The whole purpose behind multi-subnet clustering is that you want to have a single Windows cluster spread across multiple data centers. We've been able to do this in the past. That required using something called a stretched VLAN, where a single IP subnet was available in multiple data centers. This is extremely hard to configure because it requires very complex routing configurations and multiple routers all functioning as the same subnet. Any network engineer will tell you this is incredibly hard to set up. Doing multi-subnet clustering is incredibly easy because it doesn't require any complex network configuration. We use a traditional, normal subnet in each data center with normal IP routing between those two subnets. Nothing fancy or special needs to be done. We simply install nodes on each subnet. When those nodes are clustered, we simply tell SQL Server to use both subnets as part of the configuration. This is going to allow the SQL Server to fail over between the two subnets. Again, this is primarily going to be used for a multi-site configuration. For example, disaster recovery between two data centers. This has been available on Windows Server, starting with Windows Server 2008 R2. However, this was not introduced in the SQL Server product until SQL Server 2012. The reason for this is we needed to get the enhancements built into the Windows Server and failover clustering configurations first before they could be worked on in the SQL Server product team. Always remember when looking at new features and wondering why there's a delay in getting them into some products than others, you have to keep in mind that the downstream product can't work on a feature until the upstream product has released a GA or generally available version of that feature. This is a perfect example for that. The SQL Server product team was not able to work on multi-subnet clustering in SQL Server 2008 R2 because they didn't have a solid code base within Windows to work with yet. They didn't know the exact direction the Windows team was going to take to make this work in Windows 2008 R2, so instead of relying on beta code in the Windows product to get their code working, they simply hold off on working on that feature until it's released in the product. That's why SQL Server released this as a SQL Server 2012 feature, whereas Windows introduced this as a Windows 2008 R2 feature. We see the same version differencing between things like Visual Studio and BIDS or SSDT, where the SQL Server version of the Visual Studio product is always one major rev behind, because we have to rely on what's already public, not private builds. When we're configuring the multi-subnet failover, we have to do some special things within failover clustering. Basically, what we need to do is we need to tell the failover cluster that there's going to be two IP addresses, one for each subnet. The network name is then going to be bound to both of those IP addresses within the failover cluster configuration. How we know which failover clustering IP address to use is going to completely depend on an OR reference. That OR reference within the failover cluster administrator is going to tell the failover clustering which one of those IP addresses to bring online. Failover clustering knows to only bring online IP addresses within the site that the specific failover cluster node is living in. So if you've got a multi-site configuration of 192.168.0.0 and 192.168.1.0, and you try to bring an IP address online in the 192.168.1.0 subnet, failover clustering knows automatically which one of those IP addresses it needs to bring online. So whichever host owns the resource, and the resource being the IP address and the servers, that's how it's going to figure this all out, is just based on that ownership of IP addresses. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward as far as installing and configuring the SQL Server. You simply run through the wizard just like you normally would, and when prompted for an IP address, you simply give it all the various subnets that you're going to be using. So in summary, multi-subnet clustering simply allows the SQL Server to fail over between the two different subnets. This is going to greatly simplify our network topography because we don't have to have a stretch VLAN spread across two data centers.